Thank you for tuning in to the newest episode of the Plain Bible Teaching Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Soker. This episode is being released on February 8th, 2024. And this week we're talking about sports gambling and the number of Americans who are expected to bet on the Super Bowl this Sunday. We talked about this topic 2 years ago, just after the Super Bowl was played that year, when over 30 million Americans placed a bet on the Super Bowl that year. And that was a record number at the time. But this year, that number is projected to be nearly 68 million people. So I thought it would be good to revisit this topic today. For links to the story we're talking about and other related materials, check out the show notes for this episode at plainbibleteaching.com/podcast/020824. And now for our story this week. The Super Bowl is expected to smash betting records. Nearly 68 million U.S. adults plan to wager. From the Associated Press, nearly 68 million American adults, about 1 in 4, plan to bet on this year's Super Bowl, setting a record by a wide margin according to the Gambling Industry's National Trade Association. Figures released Tuesday by the American Gaming Association include bets placed with legal outlets, as well as with illegal bookies and online operations in other countries. The volume of betting participation is projected to be 35% higher than last year, which was the previous record. Bettors plan to wager an estimated $23.1 billion on this year's Super Bowl, up from $16 billion last year, the group predicted. Then later in the article, it said this: there's a good chance that every Super Bowl for the next 10 or so years will be the most bet Super Bowl thanks to the underlying growth of regulated sports betting in the U.S. So the Super Bowl is this Sunday. It's the biggest sporting event of the year, and of course, many people are going to be watching. And it's perfectly fine to enjoy watching sporting events like this. Of course, as a reminder, if you are a member of a local church that meets on Sunday evening, that is your primary obligation. Even during the day that the Super Bowl is being played, that is your primary obligation to the local church. Now, that being said, besides watching the Super Bowl, many people are also betting on the Super Bowl. A record number of people, 68 million people, 1 in 4 U.S. adults. So there are a few points I want us to consider about this. Number one, we need to recognize that gambling is inconsistent with the character of a Christian. We talked about some basic principles on this point in the episode back in 2022, and I'll link to that in the show notes if you didn't hear that episode or want to go back and listen to it again. But the fundamental reason why gambling is wrong is because of the Bible's condemnation of covetousness, the desire to obtain something that belongs to someone else. And if someone wants to deny that this is the case, that that's why they gamble, prove it by making predictions on the Super Bowl or other sporting events like that without putting money on the line. But someone might argue with that and say, well, that's not the same thing. Putting up money makes it more interesting. And of course it does. It does make it more interesting because there's an interest in obtaining someone else's money. But our interest should not be in taking from others or defrauding them of what is theirs. But our interest should be in what is in their best interest. Remember what Paul told the brethren in Philippi: do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. Second point, we need to be aware of the addictive nature of gambling. Later in that article, it said this: groups that treat or seek to prevent compulsive gambling are always concerned as the Super Bowl approaches, let alone one with the anticipated betting activity this year's game is likely to have. The Council on Compulsive Gambling of New Jersey urges bettors to set limits on their wagering, only bet what they can afford to lose, and never chase gambling losses with additional bets. That is particularly important with the widespread availability of in-game bets. The capacity to wager throughout the game allows gamblers to take as many risks as there are plays, and with every setback comes the temptation to try to recoup one's losses with yet another bet. The danger of addiction has always been there with gambling, but it is worse now with the technology that we have today. All of it can be done on your smartphone, in the comfort of your home or wherever you happen to be, with new potential wagers that can be made every single play of the game. So this is very tempting for people to get involved in it, but then continue to increase the amount of their activity and the amount that they wager and the amount that they lose. When Paul wrote to the brethren in Corinth, he said, "All things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything." Even if gambling were lawful, and we already talked about the fact that it is condemned as the Bible condemns covetousness, but even if we were to argue that gambling was lawful, we would still need to guard against becoming addicted to it, that we would not be mastered by it, as Paul said in that passage. We need to learn to exercise self-control in every area of our lives and not allow ourselves to be carried away by things like this. Number 3, we need to be especially cautious when sin is easy to commit. And that's one of the things that these groups that try to prevent gambling or compulsive gambling, what they are worried about with the Super Bowl this year especially is because it's so much easier to get involved in these wagers on the game. So when it is easy to commit sin, there's a greater danger that we will fall into sin. Now, there's an example of this principle in the wise man's warning about the adulteress in Proverbs chapter 7. Notice the tactic that she used to try to tempt the young man in that passage. So she seizes him and kisses him, and with a brazen face, she says to him, "I was due to offer peace offerings today. Today I've paid my vows. Therefore I have come out to meet you, to seek your presence earnestly, and I have found you. I have spread my couch with coverings, with colored linens of Egypt. I have sprinkled my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us drink our fill of love until morning. Let us delight ourselves with caresses. For my husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. He has taken a bag of money with him. At the full moon, he will come home." So her appeal to the young man was that everything is ready. There's no reason not to do this. Nothing standing in the way of them engaging in that affair. We need to remain pure in our lives, whether it's in sexual sins or as gambling we're talking about here. We need to remain pure in our lives no matter how many roadblocks stand between us and sin. But the fewer roadblocks there are, then the more cautious we need to be. And as it becomes easier and easier to get involved with sports gambling or other types of gambling, we need to be especially careful not to be led away by that, as so many people in the world are. Number 4, we need to be different from the world. As we read in the article, a record 68 million Americans plan to bet on the Super Bowl this year. And not only that, but the article said that it is expected that this number will go up every year for the next 10 years. So the practice of sports gambling is already becoming pervasive in our society, and it's only going to get worse. As Christians, we need to guard against becoming like the world. Remember what Paul told the brethren in Rome. "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." We need to be different from the world, a peculiar people, which incidentally is the title of an article that I just published on Plain Bible Teaching yesterday. If you're listening to this episode on the day it's released, that will be linked in the show notes, or you can go to the Plain Bible Teaching website to see that. But that is the principle that we're talking about here. We have to be different from the world, be willing to be a separate people, a people that belong to God and therefore are doing His will. So in summary, watching the Super Bowl may be fine as a source of entertainment, but we are not to introduce gambling into our enjoyment of the game. Fundamentally, gambling is wrong because it involves covetousness. Therefore, it is inconsistent with the character that we are to have as Christians. So rather than joining with the world in this practice, we need to be different from the world, pleasing the Lord and putting the interests of others ahead of ourselves. That's all for this week. Thank you for listening to the Plain Bible Teaching Podcast. I hope you found this to be interesting, informative, and helpful. For links to the story we talked about and some other related materials, check out the show notes for this episode at plainbibleteaching.com/podcast/020824. If you have a moment to rate and review the podcast or share it with those who are interested, that is always appreciated. And if you're listening to this, remember that we also upload video versions of the podcast to the Plain Bible Teaching YouTube channel. So if you prefer to watch this on video, that option is there for you. And if you are watching this on YouTube, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can see the other videos that we post here from time to time. And if you see a news story or have some topic that you think would make for a good discussion here, send that to me at andy@plainbibleteaching.com. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to talk to you again next week.